Okay, and I have in fact, for a number of months, well, this year now, had my own institute, small institute, the NeuroTech Institute. And so I still am a fellow with University of Adelaide and also with University College Dublin, Thomas Jefferson in Philadelphia, so some different places. But we've gone back into, I guess, the really practical implications and working with organisations and still doing research, but also working with health systems because there's just so much that we can do to actually put things into practice. So what I want to do today is to start you off by hopefully delighting you in terms of just how wonderful the brain can be and is, and the possibilities that you have of being able to change it and do all sorts of things with it. And in the roles that you've got, it's pretty important to remind yourself of that sometimes, because having worked with Alzheimer's, I say, for a number of years, and with individuals, and also I have my mother, who's 90 now, and jokes that she lives at the bottom of my garden, but she's actually in a little tiny cottage in a garden in the base of our bigger cottage, and it's interesting, delightful, and difficult all together, which is really what it's like with working with people with dementia and Alzheimer's. So what I want to do then is to start you off by thinking about the brain as a work in progress. So all of you undoubtedly in this room know that it's not a fixed system, that we update and change our brain all of the time. And one of the things that really drew me into it, I didn't actually do a neuroscience PhD until 50. In fact, I did the double PhD of systems engineering and cognitive neuroscience because it just seemed to really go together well in terms of how do complex systems work, neural or organic. And it's also ended up with me working a lot with artificial intelligence and technology and interaction between people and technology. And as we know, we nowadays quite often reach for a technological answer to things, and there are times when there isn't one. It is human aptitude that is the answer. So that interface is really fantastic. It doesn't mean I don't work with really terrific technologies in terms of assisting us to do a really good job. So your brain prunes, your brain changes, so it's very plastic. I think we prune about a neuron a second, and then we can change it depending on what we pay attention to, because that's very much how you stimulate the kind of chemicals that you need to change the way that your brain's wired. And we also build brand new brain. And one of the lovely things for everyone in this room is you can build new brain all of your life, providing you turn on the sufficient chemicals and then inspire your brain to take in new information. So what I thought I'd do first, my click's not working, is to take you through the 5 major ways, in fact there's a 6th, to build brain. So one of the things, and we heard about it from Barry a lot, is movement. So when you move sufficiently, because we're kind of built to move at about 20 kilometres a day actually, which is so close to what he was talking about. We're built to move constantly, we're built to solve complex problems on the move. So moving does a number of things, especially for hippocampal areas, and that's to do with memory and learning, and that's particularly one of the areas that has to be hopefully dealt with and improved, bulked up in terms of Alzheimer's. So movement is pretty important. And then the second one is sleep. So who sleeps 7 hours a day here? Some. Who sleeps more? Oh, right. Actually, who sleeps over 8 hours? Okay, because you can actually sleep too much as well. But certainly better than, yeah, who sleeps 6 or under? Okay, so who naps? Okay, good. Who naps at work? Everyone laughs at that. Yeah, and in fact, if I was to sell you something that said, you would, for 20 minutes, within 20 minutes, you would increase your motor skills, you'd freshen your mood, you'd empty your inbox, you'd do all sorts of things that were wonderful, and you'd buy it, and it's just a nap. So some companies insist, actually, that you nap for 20 minutes. In fact, Google, when I work with them, if you're not there by 3 o'clock and you haven't gone into your sleep pod, they'll tap you on the shoulder. Excuse me, go and have a nap and make it better for all of us. And it's really good if you actually do nap. Anyway, so the interesting thing about sleep, and there's some brand new evidence now on new links between sleep and dementia, so it's even more interesting for this group. So what you do with sleep, first I guess I'll go through the specific links. One of the things that we do think about now is Alzheimer's is a little bit different to a lot of the dementias, as I'm sure you know, in terms of it not actually meeting most of the bases of brain aging. It's actually a different kind of process, and it's mainly to do with the build-up of a particular type of chemical and the APPs and tangles and tau. And so what happens with those things is if you get sleep, you actually it's a major way for your brain to clean off a number of those things. So it becomes really critical. But that happens in the later times, that happens in the cycles of sleep, which are maintenance. And so you need to get that sleep. And if you're older, then sometimes what happens is you get disturbed sleep. So the more unwell a person is, and with aging you tend to have parts of your body that don't work as well, so you get hypoxia in sleep sometimes, you don't breathe as well, or you can even stop and start, and what that does is stop your brain from being able to do that work. So it's really important that we make sure that people sleep well for that situation, but it's also important that we sleep well so that we don't start that process, because we know that it's 20, 30 years ahead in front. So the really quick way of thinking about sleep is the first few cycles you have maintenance. So it does exactly that. It cleans your brain, your heart rate drops, all sorts of things happen with major muscles. So it's working at making your brain and your body come back up to scratch. And then you can see the dark blue bars as you get the third and fourth and fifth cycles of sleep, and they're rapid eye movement. So most of the rapid eye movements happens in the late hours of sleep. So at about hour 6 average, depending on your sleep cycles, you go into something called pre-REM 2, which means that you start to file what you've learnt during the day into memory and into mid to maybe even long-term memory. And if you don't do that, if you don't even sleep that long, you often don't even file information. And then you go into REM. So rapid eye movement, one of the fascinating things, who remembers their dreams? And do you do things that you can't normally do outside a dream? Like, you fly, some people fly, some people walk through walls. Yep, they do all those sorts of things. And the fascinating thing about that is the frontal lobe, which is your policeman of logic, your rules around what works, that's turned down in REM. So there's nothing to stop your brain playing and coming up with all these wonderful new things, which is also why we come up with our creative ideas in late sleep. So especially on a weekend, or if you're not woken up by an alarm, kind of mid-cycle, then often you'll wake up and you'll go, that's what I'll do, or you have a brand new idea. So sleep on it is actually absolutely right. So sleep is very underrated in terms of what it does, not only for our brains and bodies, but I work with creative companies as well, and they're quite insistent about the levels of sleep. Okay, I have to keep looking at making sure that we do that. And again, the late sleep, we get epigenetic changes in that late cycle. And we get different chemicals which come in and again look at memory, quite particularly, and look at neurogenesis. So the kinds of chemicals, the kind of BDNFs that you need are coming into the brain at that time. So once again, that's a very important time for dementia and Alzheimer's people to get some repair. Okay, so naps and daydreaming. Does anybody daydream? Like, to make sure that they stop a task and actually look out the window, and you'll see that aha movement in a moment, suddenly, or in the shower or somewhere where you're just kind of offline. Because when you do that, when we're trying to concentrate on something, we often shove our brains down a rabbit hole of this is where the information is. But once you let that go, because of the way that we fractionate information all over our brain, it lets our brain go, thank goodness, now I can go and take the bits from the different areas and I can package it up and I can give it to you. And so that's why you'll suddenly go, okay, that's it. And it's because you've stopped trying to corral your brain into another area. You've allowed that subconscious to connect things up and then sort of give it back up into your conscious memory. And naps are really good at that. Daydreaming's really good at that as well. So it's like we carry things around like an inbox when we work with each other and when we do various things in the morning, and it just gets fuller and fuller and fuller. And what a nap does is allow you to kind of pop that data into your short-term memory, just to see if you're going to need it. And it clears space for us to do something, do other things. Okay, so one of the things that was fascinating to me is there's some brand new work on the fact that people with dementia stop daydreaming. And that's another discussion completely probably, but one of the things about that then is if when they don't have stimuli in front of them, they don't daydream, you have to treat them quite differently in terms of how you cue what they do in real time. Because if they're not able to then escape into thinking about things in the way that we can daydream, then they're very much in the present. It's why they are driven by things they see in the present. But what was even more interesting was specifically people with Alzheimer's still do daydream. So it's a different type of damage in the brain. And so it's a positive thing, because at least people with Alzheimer's still can daydream. They can still get that kind of capacity to be able to pick things up. You're nodding, isn't it fascinating? So what it does is it allows us to be able to utilise that, because at least we know that people can think on things and dream on things. And so you're not quite so stuck in just having to make sure that they have things right in front of them which stimulate them adequately. So again, it's a really interesting difference. And the other thing is that, especially with older people, because we know that we're this complex system, and as we age, more and more intermingled things go wrong and cause other things to go wrong. So coronary health is important as well for mental illness. And if you let people nap at least 3 times a week, then there's a 37% decrease in the potential for their coronary, and us too. It's all of us. So napping is really important. Don't laugh about naps. They're really useful. Right, the next way is novelty. So if you think about your brain being taken up by the information it's got, by the areas of expertise that you've built up, which are like lovely 3D spider webs of knowledge and information. If you want to look at something brand new, then basically the brain has to build new real estate to put that new information in. So a really good way for someone, say my age, or even probably mid-age, so younger than me, is to take up something like a language. And so you've all heard that, oh yes, taking up a language is really good for your brain. One of the reasons is because of willpower and work. So when you have to learn a new language that you haven't had as a child, you have to build a whole new syntax for that language. So that's one thing which is difficult. But the other thing that language does is it means that your brain not only had to work hard to put all of that new data in a new part of your brain, but every time you think in the other language, it has to work to convert what you naturally think in into that other language. And so it's constantly working, which means that it's a really good thing to do. But any form of thing that captures your attention and your heart is a really useful thing to do in terms of having to build new brain to start to store and to start to connect across that information. So always surprise people slightly, keep them surprised with new things that they can do. And that's one of the things, and we love it too, because we get this dopamine and oxytocin and a little bit of serotonin uptake, and we get all these lovely chemicals that happen when we come up to something new and we actually get interested and want to do it. And then we can really get on a roll and love it and be full of chemicals. One of the biggest, so I haven't said about microbiome, so one of the things that is really critical as well is what you eat. So we know that second gut, 1.5 million neurons in our gut. And in fact, in about the 6th week of life, the neural crest divides and makes 2 types of brain. So we've got the central nervous system and this brain, which takes a long time to cook. And we've got the enteric nervous system and this brain, which is really quick to be able to tell at least how we digest food, because otherwise on day 1 you would die. So we've got a really interesting process. We also host a lot of bacteria that make the kind of neurotransmitters that we need, because we can't make probably at least 30% of what our brain needs to work well. So they're like Lego blocks. We make them through the bacteria that we host, and then they click them together, send them up, often vagal nerve, and off goes the brain. That can use them well. So what you eat really does change the way that your brain works. And one of the things to think about is chewing. So I do a talk called Mushy Food, Mushy Brain. And it's actually around, with older people, if they don't crunch food, there's various chemicals they do not stimulate into their brain, which is really critical for brain health. It's another really interesting area. And so when you then chase it back, so we did some work a couple of years ago on saying, okay, so we know that taste buds aren't quite as sensitive, but you can actually retrain them. But we don't. We tend to just put more salt, more things on, TV dinners, those sorts of things, and people sit there and eat those kind of things. And it's the worst thing you can do for their brain, because if you give them that crunchy food, so the next step is then, why do they not want the crunchy food? And it's not actually that they're just getting given the sustagen or something like that to tick the box, and then you can let them eat whatever they like. If you actually put the money into dental care, because that's one of the biggest issues, is they actually can't crunch because they don't have really good dentures, because certainly in Australia, that's not seen as a normal part of our health system, which is crazy. So if you have, as soon as you correct that and they can chew properly, hey presto, they can eat crunchy food, and then various chemicals start to be released in their brain. So not only what you eat, but the way that you prepare it is really critical. Right. The biggest thing, which is really lovely for us, in terms of building brand new brain and stimulating all sorts of things, everything from the immune system on, is direct human interaction. So I got really fascinated in this in terms of adaptive companies, why some creative groups or organisations flourish. I used to work with autistic children, and that whole eye gaze thing was fascinating to me. So what we've learnt now is we've got various different neurons that go off straight away. So in about a sixth of a second, when you're looking at somebody, mirror neurons, various subsets of mirror neurons start to fire. And a lot of them are around smiles and laughter, and they're around intent. There's a number of different types. So they begin that lovely oxytocin, dopamine kind of dance with someone quite immediately. The second is the spindle neuron, or the Vodoconnimo neuron. And that's called the trust neuron very often, because it connects across between task and emotion. And again, that's quicker. That's a 12th of a second. And so that starts to build up a process of trust and where you sit socially. So neurons that are spindle neurons are only in animals that have long-term social structures. So primates, humans, elephants, anything where you've got many, many years where you have to figure out my relationship and my interrelationship with you. And that's very strongly spindle neurons. And I'm doing some work now on whether it's spindle neurons that fire. Because if you look at someone over a screen, and you've never seen them in person, there are certain things that never stand up in your brain. They only stand up when you see a person in real life. So I'm doing some work now on what is it? What are those things? And imagine what that means for remote working, for all sorts of things. And then dynamic resonance. So as we get better with technology, that's where technology is fantastic, we can actually read now that there are various chemicals that resonate across the space between human bodies. So we knew that some of them, we knew that things like if women work together for a period of time, then their monthly cycles then go in cycle. And guess what? So do the men's. You just don't notice it as much. But what we don't know, we can feel if we're in a room where people are positive and excited, we kind of just feel that, and we can also feel if there's huge levels of tension, but we can actually pick up lots more in terms of the chemicals. It's one of the reasons why it's really nice to sit in a room like this, because you get all sorts of resonance and resonating chemicals from the other people that you're sitting with. And that's, animals can pick them up really clearly. It's why your dog just comes and sits on your lap if you're upset, because you're putting out so much, you just don't realise. So we have these wonderful, we're an electrochemical bag. I know it's not romantic, but that's what we are. And we just synchronise and resonate with each other all the time over space. Eye gaze is quite particularly nice now, but that we can measure. So I get the nice job of putting things like caps on people and watching their brains light up. And so that little child, the mum, her socio-emotional parts of her brain will be firing really strongly, and that's exactly what she's lighting up in that baby. And we do it with people that we know, and we do it with, if we're really good storytellers, that's why we love a storyteller, because when we put caps on people and watch, someone who's really good at getting across a feeling and an idea and a story is just able to physically light up that other person's brain. And it's a sender-receiver thing, because it is an electrical impulse you can look at. And at first, that sender-receiver has a gap effect, a lag effect, but the more you get to know people as well, the shorter that lag effect, because you actually get physically tuned in to them. So when you really know someone, it's why you can almost read their mind. You know what they're going to say, because your brain just connects, and yep, you're already there. And it's a really interesting thing to watch. There's also even some work around scanning people who are not yet leaders in some companies, and the ones that are really strong in that socio-emotional area, they're now watching whether they'll become the sort of adaptive, charismatic leaders of the future, because that's how important it is. And whenever we scan leaders' brains, which was part of my thesis, that is absolutely what you see. The adaptive, the leader that you would, walk through fire for, massive firing in all of those socio-emotional areas, really high connector. So, what does that mean? There's a particular thing I wanted to just mention. I did a study, which we'll talk about, on direct touch and eye gaze and its impact on healing and the therapeutic relationship. But retinal eye lock was something that, for me, came out of it. It's not actually in that study because of the way systematic reviews are made, I couldn't put it in, but I'm writing about it now. So what retinal eye lock's about is, I don't know if any of you have got children, or if you've got patients that when they're a bit upset or anxious, they will look more into your eyes more often. It's because we get a lot of oxytocin when we look at someone else's eyes directly, if we trust them and know them. And we get dopamine, we get serotonin uptake increase, we get all sorts of things that happen. And we will tend to increase that because we need that connection if we're anxious, because of the way that the other kinds of loops of chemicals start to move. So what you've got with retinal eye lock, if we have an example, if I come in and I'm coming into, say, an aged care home, and I meet one of you as my carer at the beginning, then immediately I'm going to start making those lovely, mirror neuron, spindle neuron type of connections. If you put your hand on my arm, or you touch me in any way, warmly and gently, then that sets off C fibres. So we have basically A fibres and C fibres in the skin. It's the biggest sensory organ of our body. A fibres are those really quick 100 miles an hour myelin sheath ones that let you drop a hot pot if you pick it up. But there's actually a gap between dropping it and feeling the pain, because that's the C fibre. And that's the ouch, which is, they're very slow. They're about 10 miles an hour, they're non-myelated, and they go through, the fascinating thing is, they go through the emotional parts of your brain before that stimuli hits your brain. So an easy way to think about it is, if you were sitting with your partner and you were getting on really nicely and they stroke your arm, that would feel nice. If you've just had a fight and they stroke your arm, it feels irritating. And if someone suddenly ran up behind you in the street and started to stroke your arm, it would just feel creepy. It's exactly the same stimuli for the body, but the brain interprets it completely differently, because the emotional step says, no, this is different. So those C fibres are really powerful in terms of what they convey to the brain about how you are touched and what that connection means. So if you do touch someone, it's why you automatically, have this feeling of further connection. It's also why if you're just about to cry, you don't want someone to hold you, because as soon as they do, you burst into tears. That's exactly why, because of those sorts of fibre attenuation activities, which is the scientific side of it. So then if that person gets upset, quite often what we now are supposed to do is give them pharmaceuticals, or to even, some places, have very fancy technological restraints. There's all those ways to bring someone down. If, on the other hand, you, as a person who I've met when I came in, have 5 minutes to come and sit with me and look at me and touch me and listen and just talk, then what happens is My cortisol has gone up, my oxytocin's gone down, my immune system's starting to be hit, my parasympathetic nervous system's not firing, I'm picking up serotonin, I've got all sorts of things happening, adrenaline's going up. All of those things change. Every one of them goes the opposite. So in 5 minutes, what you can do is start my oxytocin back up. You can start my immune system firing positively. And we also have hippocampal areas. So my brain, the affect in my brain starts to fire differently. And physically, I start to calm down. So we also get more dopamine than if you were to give me a medicine. It's at that level. So we are amazing in terms of what we can do just by that presence, in terms of physically changing, physiologically and physically changing what's happening. So never underestimate that you have that superpower to do that, because it's incredible. And always make sure that you're in a situation where you give yourself the time and give the other person the time to be able to do that. Okay, so voice, just quickly, because I'm probably going to take ages otherwise. Voice is also amazing. In Scotland last year, working with a guy on the resonance of voice. And so it turns out, I'll just put that down in there, there's all sorts of things that synchronize. So the voice sits at about 3 to 8 megahertz. Our brain has an area that's always oscillating at 3 to 8 megahertz to pick up the voice. It also connects down to pleasure centers and does all that sort of thing. We love the human voice. It's why radio will never die. It's why we love being spoken to. It's why I work with the Department of Defense in America with their autonomous robots in the field. And you can give them all of the trusted autonomous robots you like. If a soldier gets worried, they've got fascinating and terrific data that will come off their robot. They completely ignore it and they pick up the radio. And it's because we need to connect to other people, especially when we're in a stress situation. And the voice, our ears work like radar, so they pick up 3 to 8 megahertz. They're particularly tuned to that, which is why you can hear a human voice in a crowd. And so we just do so many things with that kind of alpha and theta and gamma that, again, calms our brains down and calms our bodies down. So that has a lovely reason behind it. I wanted to put this up because I wanted to show just how physical this is. So on the left is a 3-year-old brain of a child who has been touched and held and adored and stimulated and taught. So that child, yes, they've pruned and also they've rewired, but they've built massive amounts of new dendrites, new brain, to differentiate their brain. On the right is a 3-year-old who has been profoundly ignored. So they've kept pruning, but nothing has stimulated new growth. Now, this happens too for people as they grow if you stick them into an aged care centre and no one goes near them. So it will happen at any time with us, but it especially happens at times where that human connection is vital to people and they don't get a lot of other stimulation. So if you do all of the things we've talked about, then you get minimal, shrinkage, but you certainly will get changes in white and grey areas in matter if you don't do that. Okay, so I guess what I'd like to say then is we definitely do change people. And so we don't get to choose that. We get to choose how we change people, whether it's a positive change or a negative change in terms of interacting. All right, the study, I'll run through it quickly because I'm going to leave you with the slides, which is much easier than you trying to write this bit down. So I'm just letting you know that there's data. So I looked at, it started with working with the Dean of Nursing in Adelaide Uni, an Irish woman who was passionately saying over wine. We'd just done an ageing think tank and we were sitting there having a glass of wine and she said, it's really important that we have nurses there if the person's ill. We know that if they're upset, but we can't prove it. And I thought, yes, we can. We could assay chemicals. We can have a look at their amygdala firing. We can have a look at, what goes up and down in various things, their immune system. So first, in a university, first you have to do a review and papers. So that's what we had to, so that's what I did. And so what I looked at was some of the quantitative ways, not qualitative. This was actually measured. It wasn't the questionnaires, because I wanted really robust data. So the data is around how much it modulates the social brain structures. So that's the stuff we've just talked about. how much you reframe vulnerability because of the way that the amygdala fires, how much the serotonin goes up, the oxytocin goes up, the effect of neuroplasticity, the immune system changes, because oxytocin is really important for the endocrine system. And so it really does assist with healing. And also, it has quite a large effect on hope as well as morbidity and mortality. So that was really interesting. Touch, we've talked about some of those things, so the C fibres. And I think I've talked about most of that, really. Yeah, the kangaroo care. It's really fascinating watching a baby's brain in kangaroo care. Therapeutic massage was really interesting in terms of what it does release in your body. And we've talked about the fact that if you calm the things like the HPA axis in the brain, you can even help people to deal with pain as well as to deal with being anxious. But the unexpected result was the immune system changes. No matter what the type of massage, the immune system always kicks in. So there was a terrific example of a woman, of a group who were getting massaged, they were going through radiotherapy. And what they ended up doing was measuring what that impact was of 40 minutes full body massage before they went into the radiotherapy. And actually, NK killer cells are something that gets killed very often in radiotherapy. They didn't. They were more robust because someone had touched and massaged them for 40 minutes. So we're still learning all of the wonderful things that we do when we interact. Okay, so another thing that I'd leave with you is the amygdala activation, that it lowers a number of things we've talked about. So it lowers that activity across the parasympathetic, sympathetic, and autonomic nervous system. It quietens them all down. And that means that you can maintain, or your patient can maintain, that kind of autonomic balance better. They're calmer because you soothe, I guess, basically. Again, pain and anxiety modulation and feelings. So the summary then of that in terms of human connection is that there are neurophysiological changes, that there are amygdala changes, that there are immunological changes, that there are changes in pain response and in hope, and that there are changes in empathy, both you and the person, which is really fascinating to watch how when you interact and when you give those people those different changes in chemical cycles, the lovely thing about humans is you're getting them too, because they are cyclic. So the more empathically you care for someone, the better able you are to actually pick up information around how they are, because you use a different part of your brain when empathy kicks in. We actually have something called the discernment mode, which kicks in, which means that you use different criteria to pick up information. You look for more nuanced information, and you look for the consequential outcomes of what you're doing and what you're seeing. So we listen differently, and and doctors prescribe differently. They pick up different information. It's also why you as a mum will know your child's sick usually the day before the doctor does. You know, you take them that day early because you've already picked up all those signs. So we're very good at that. Yeah, so it lowers stress. Okay, you could just think about the obvious connections with people who are grieving as well. So a lot of those things are very similar. So I've written down for you about coping capacity and, again, anxiety modulation and feelings regulation. So it's the same sort of thing in the person who's having to get used to their parent or another person being different, changing. Now, I had to get used to when Mum had a stroke. The same person was just not there. That was it. It was a different person and I adored her, and there were some of the similarities. And you have to go through that as well in the same sort of situation. So trust and empathy is a really important part then of what you give to someone in that situation, in that healing process. And again, I've got some information there, particularly around the sorts of mediation that when you are empathic, you create in another person. So I've narrowed down to the parasympathetic nervous system, to the changing in the decision pathways. So just to get you to be able to look at that if you want to. And another thing that was fascinating, and I've been doing some work in Mount Sinai on this, was hope. So it just seemed, there's a beautiful book, The Anatomy of Hope, I think it's Groupman, and he's a person who for 40 years was a specialist, and he noticed that some people healed better, those that had hope tended to survive a lot better than those that didn't have hope. And so again, plunging into it, there's some qualitative and quantitative data here on what happens with hope. So again, if you are hopeful, if someone inspires you to hope, then pro-inflammatory cytokines drop and wound repair is faster. You can actually quantify it. The depression pathway is different, so people do not get as depressed as quickly. So what you've got is quality as well as quantity in terms of how people heal. And also you have epigenetic changes, which gets very technical, but that's how much of an impact hope has on the body and the brain. But if they don't trust you, and if you don't interact with someone, you do not build up that connection that allows for that hope to grow. So you can't just give hope, over an app. It doesn't work. Okay, so we've talked about respect. You don't do this. You actually talk to people, so sometimes I work with medicos and it's really interesting having that whole discussion. Again, I've let you know that the carer empathy, you get a lot of the same chemicals, and you are more candid in how much you can pick up the information, and also it really increases that radar. So you can really have a look at how people make a different decision. It's one of the experiments I'm just about to run in terms of making complex decisions with or without another human being there, because it does change the way that your brain works. I'm not going to go through these, but I'll leave them with you because I know that you're very well set up for patient-centric care. But what I've done is pulled out some of the latest studies, and we're actually doing one at the moment around the physical setup of how you set up physical spaces for people with dementia and Alzheimer's. So I will leave that with you because I just want to see if you've got some questions. And said, okay, so with what you've got is they have a set capability to think and problem solve. What is it that you do? So I've run through the physical environment, the social environment, and the staff ratio. They're the other big things that are coming out in work around what's important. I've also looked at the training. So what are the most positive, impactful types of training for the home care staff? So I've left you with that. What are the main success factors? And they are the things that we know. You get face-to-face training from people that have done it, and they've got those experience capabilities to make something bespoke. You also have a capability for people to keep reflecting and then to try. So if you've got a supportive culture, then they can have a go and experiment. If you haven't, then they find it really difficult. The operational outcomes are things like improved communication and activity, the well-being that you've got, and also that's personal and family. There are marked drops in drug use and in patient distress, and the kinds of things that we expect. So the empathy, the knowledge, the consideration for the individual, all of those things, those radar go up. And the major barriers when you look at patient-centred care training in the last 5 to 10 years has been people don't have the space to try things, they don't get any feedback with anything that they do try, or they've got no time to do it. So you probably know that anyway, but it's just really good to reinforce that for you. So I guess I want you to think about what is it in the future. I work in Finland quite a lot, and there's a lot of, every age fits into there. So not only are there kindies in their dementia care homes, they have students, they have Airbnb, they have all sorts of things where people mix an awful lot. And in fact here, there's a, what was that? I think that's University of Melbourne, no. Sydney, University of Sydney has just done something called Gold Soul, and so they've got students and health students actually living in aged care facilities, and very often they choose then to work in aged care. Guess what? Because you get to know how wonderful it is. So I think that I want to, and you've probably heard of the Netherlands Group, yes. So those sorts of plans are being used in quite a few countries now. I'm now working with a little Neo robot and actually watching people's brains when they interact with the Neo robot, and then when they watch their trusted carer, just to see the difference, so that we can know how we use technology and how we don't when we don't. So yeah, it's really a case of saying that we really do need to understand the power of direct connection. And if we do understand that, we can use it in a really maximal way. We can also use technology to enable that. And it's a really beautiful thing to think about in terms of humans, in terms of people. Oh, and I've got online, I've written this, looking up. I've got a couple here that are printed out, but if you actually want one printed out, you just write to me. But that's free, so you can download it. It looks gorgeous. It doesn't seem to print so well, but that sums up a lot of the science that I've talked about, and you can keep that and have that as something to refer to.